Great. Good morning. Welcome to this Resolution Foundation event called Work is Where the Heart Is. I'm Mike Brewer, the Interim Chief Executive here. You're very welcome in the room and online. Now, everyone loves talking about hard-working families, but what's the labour market actually like, and what's work actually like for low to middle income families? That's the question we are asking and hopefully answering today. And to do that, we're launching today the second report from our Unsung Britian series. It's a year-long project where we are looking in detail at what are the key challenges for low to middle income families, what's changed over the past 2 or 3 decades, and what does that mean for government or any other organisation that wants to help them. The whole project is supported by the JPMorganChase Foundation, to whom we are very grateful. And to help us unpack that question, we've got an amazing panel. On my far right, Nye Comenetti is a principal economist here. He writes our annual Low Pay Britain report and works on the living wage, and he'll give you an overview of what's in today's report. If you're watching at home or at work, please go and download that and you can read along at the same time. And then from outside the foundation, we have Kate Bell, who is Assistant General Secretary at the TUC and has previously done many things, including being on the Low Pay Commission. Donald Hirsch, who's Policy Advisor to the Aberdeen Financial Fairness Trust and Emeritus Professor at the University of Loughborough, where he led the Centre for Research and Social Policy for a decade, and Katie Jones, who is Head of the Decent Work and Productivity Research Centre at Manchester Metropolitan University and co-leader of Metropolis, which is the awesomely named think tank of the same university. So you can already see there's not much about the working lives of low to middle income families this panel don't know about. You're in very good hands. If you want to join in online, you can go to Slido, where the code is Labour Market, where you will be able to ask questions and do a poll at the end. If you're in the room, you can also do that if you'd like. But if you're feeling more extrovert, you can also put your hand up and there'll be an actual microphone for you to ask questions. I think that's all I need to say. So, Nye, will you kick us off and tell us what's in today's report?
I will. Thank you very much, Mike. First of all, thank you to Louise, who's sitting at the back there, who worked on this report with me. Thank you, Louise. Let me go back one. That's a sneak preview. So today I was going to talk about the kinds of work that low to middle income families do, how they feel about their work, and also how they feel about progressing at work and changing jobs and what that might mean for policy. Now, a certain member of the panel told me that this first slide might be too nerdy, but I said, no, it's an RF audience. They would like nothing better than to start with a plot of the income distribution. So here you are. So the reason I'm showing you this is because all of these slides are about low to middle income families, which is a term we have invented. So I thought I should explain what that is. And it is families who have an income below the median. So that's all the people in green there, and this is the whole population median, but we exclude pensioner families. So we exclude families where one or more of the adults is of pensionable age. So that's what it looks like. The typical disposable income of low to middle income families per year is 19,000, and that compares to about 44,000 for higher income families. And there are about 13 million of each of these types of families in the UK. So you'll see the word low to middle income a lot, but that is what I mean by it throughout. When I say low to middle income workers, what I mean is the workers in those families. Okay, so not workers with bottom half wages, but the workers in those families whose family income is in the bottom half. So forgive me for starting there, but I thought that was important so you all know what we're all talking about today. So first of all, the most basic facts I think you need to know about workers in these families, or the people in these families, is one, that their employment rates are lower. So we've got low to middle income families on the left, higher income families on the right. So we have a large employment difference of 61% to 90% in the most recent Family Resources Survey data in 2022-23. And if in work, they're more likely to be low paid. So we've got about a third of those low to middle income families, when in work, are in the have hourly pay in the bottom 20%. And as you can see, that's much lower for higher income families. Now, there are plenty of sort of asterisks and caveats to add to this. I will explain that the low pay, low income relationship is far from fully overlapping. We have some high paid people in low income families. But I think these important facts are good to start with because they explain a lot of what I will come on to show you in terms of the types of work that people do and how they feel about that work. So let's start off with some good news, which is that over the last 25 years, there's been a really significant increase in employment at the bottom end of the income distribution. Obviously, at the moment, we're all preoccupied with employment being a bit lower than we thought it was pre-pandemic, although the house view in the Resolution Foundation is that that might be a bit overstated. But zooming out, you can see that the last 25 years, it's been a positive story of rising employment. We've got men in the left panel, women in the left panel, men in the right-hand panel, and you can see that for both men and women, at the bottom end of the income distribution, really important increases in employment since the mid-90s. And it's that increase in employment which really drove income growth for those low-income families in the 90s and then again in the 2010s. The important thing to say here is that this rising employment has happened for more or less all subgroups within the low to middle income family group. So people with disabilities, people of different ethnicities, people living in different parts of the country. So it's not the case that there was some compositional shift which pushed that employment up. In fact, the opposite is the case. Had it just been about composition, it would have gone in the other direction. Okay, so we already know that low to middle income workers are in general lower paid. On that basis, it won't be surprising to find that the types of jobs they do are typically lower paying jobs. So you've got low to middle income workers in green, higher income workers in blue, and you can see that they're more likely to work in lower paying sectors like retail, social care, and in hospitality. And when we look at broad occupation groups, they're more likely to work in lower paid occupation groups. So elementary occupations there, which means things like cleaners, and also caring, leisure and service occupations. Obviously a big overlap there between the social care industry. So that's the kind of types of jobs they're doing. We also think they're more likely to have insecure jobs. Now we've put quotes around insecure because that can mean many different things. You can define it in different ways, but I think here are some categories of work that I think many people would say have some amount of insecurity about them, albeit in different forms. So these categories are solo self-employment, so that's being a self-employed person, but you're not running a business, you're working on your own. People whose job is temporary, gig work, but here specifically looking at gig workers doing courier or driving jobs, and 0 hours contracts. And you can see that in all cases, low to middle income workers are more likely to have these types of jobs. You should also probably think about the levels we're talking about here, so you'll know that all these numbers are, below 14%, that's where the axis goes to. So it is the case that the vast majority of low to middle income workers are in quote unquote secure jobs, at least on this definition, i.e. they're not in any of these categories, but they are more likely than higher income workers to face insecurity at work. Okay, so how do people feel about these jobs? Let's, and I should have started by saying we undertook focus groups in Worcester several weeks ago with low to middle income workers, and that's informed a lot of what we've done in this report, and so I'll be drawing on some of those especially for this section, but there's a lot of quotes in the report if you want to read it in a bit more detail. But to start off, first of all, with some quantitative evidence. So this is from a somewhat old bit of survey evidence now and Understanding Society data set, but it was really useful, I thought, because it was a set of questions about what people value in work, and it allowed us to compare low-income people, so this is people, not just workers, but people, and higher-income people, and you have all these different categories, so security, using your abilities, physical working conditions, and so on. My first takeaway from this chart was that low-income and high-income workers want many of the same things from work. So if you rank the top 5 for those low and high-income groups, you get many of the same things. People want a job that they enjoy, that offers security, and where they get on with their bosses and their colleagues. There are some differences, so you can see that for low-income workers, security is slightly more prioritized than for higher income. But I think broadly speaking, I found that interesting. Broadly, people want the same things from work. The question is, do they get it? So we unfortunately can't go through each of these categories and draw you a chart and say workers do or don't get these things. But we can look at overall job satisfaction, and then we can draw on our qualitative work to try and dig into this a bit more. So first of all, it is the case that lower income workers have lower job satisfaction than higher income workers. So that might suggest these workers aren't getting all these things at work, or at least not all of those things maybe. So here is a measure of job satisfaction. Very simply, are you satisfied with your job? And you can see that lower income workers have lower rates of job satisfaction than higher income workers. Again, though, it's important to look at the levels because we're still here talking about the vast majority saying that they are satisfied, but there is a satisfaction gap across the income distribution. So why might that be? Can we offer any clues? Well, when we spoke to our focus group participants, sorry, I'm talking slowly to let the slides move along, there were really three issues that these workers highlighted that made their jobs difficult or that made them, feel dissatisfied with their work. So one of these things was a lack of control over the working week. And this was, so we were talking to workers who were doing zero-hour contracts work, working in social care. And so, many of these people will potentially face this problem of, hours changing week on week, and that potentially has an impact on incomes. But interestingly, that wasn't the aspect of sort of hours changing that they first of all highlighted. It was that lack of control, so not knowing which hours you're going to work when, having your evenings messed up by being told you have to come and do an extra shift. That kind of thing was really highlighted by a number of workers. And there's a quote there that I think exemplifies that. Just to add a little bit of data on top of that, here is the proportion of workers across the income distribution who regularly or always work on weekends. And you can see that it is the case that lower income workers do more work on the weekends. So that, I think, ties up there quite nicely. The second thing that was highlighted that made work difficult or reduced satisfaction was stress at work. Here's a nice quote with someone working in a call center talking about how she was timed for every call. She found that very stressful. Sometimes she'd be talking to an elderly person who needed more time, but the structure of her job didn't allow that. So that was highlighted by a number of workers as well. And then finally, simply bad managers. So this was not a complex point. This was very simply people having to deal with managers that spoke to them disrespectfully, that didn't try to give them enough notice when there was a shift change, didn't make sure work was allocated fairly across the team, or just literally didn't treat them with the dignity that they felt they deserved. So that was highlighted a lot. And I think a really obvious lesson here is that if you're an employer, putting aside any questions about policy, you can do better by your workers just by making sure you're treating them well. And that was something that was important to all the workers in our groups. Okay, last mini section was going to be, if the slides move, about some policy implications. Here we go, lessons for policymakers. You get it with a tense delay. Okay, so first of all, progression isn't for everyone. Now, that might sound obvious, but I think the reason it's worth mentioning is that the idea of progression is baked into various bits of our employment policy infrastructure, if you like, not least how universal credit is administered. But it came across really strongly when we asked workers, not even necessarily about changing jobs, which definitely people said, that feels risky, I don't want to do it. It really has to be, a very obviously good job move for me to take that risk. But even more narrowly progressing in work, so staying with the same employer but moving to a higher paying job, albeit with some more responsibilities. Most of the workers we spoke to said that wasn't something they were interested in. It wasn't worth the stress or the hassle. So here's a quote exemplifying that. Just someone saying, my current job, I feel, used up at the end of the day. It's all I can manage. I just don't want to go into a high paying job. And I think that's important. I think it's important when we're doing something like administering an in-work conditionality system, which we do now have in universal credit, that we remember that not all workers will want or perhaps be able to progress in work, either by changing jobs or taking on a job with more responsibilities. Just to give some examples of that, here is a measure of the proportion of people changing jobs in a given year. And I'm showing you some categories that have lower rates of job changes compared to the average. So in the yellow bars, it's just how many job moves do those people make compared to average. In the black hash bars, it's if all other characteristics are held constant, what is the difference? So keeping other things held constant. And you can see that older workers, people with lower qualifications, people with caring responsibilities, or women with children, they're all less likely to change jobs in a given year. And I think it's probably a useful reminder that we might, or perhaps shouldn't expect all of those workers to make those, to make those job moves, as I think we do at the moment in some parts of our system. But we have here Katie, the expert on in-work conditionality, so hopefully we can get into that in a bit more detail. Secondly, don't rely on the minimum wage to raise income. So the minimum wage is obviously a very important tool for raising low pay, but because low income house people are A, not all in work, B, more likely to be self-employed than the average, C, not all low paid, the impact on incomes, and fourthly, more of their earnings are withdrawn as they earn more because they're more likely to be in means-tested benefits. You can see that the impact on incomes is much, much more muted than it is on earnings for when the minimum wage goes up. Here we're modelling a 7% minimum wage increase, which is what is going to happen next year, holding all other parts of the tax and benefit system constant. And you can see that the impact on incomes really is quite muted. So if you want to raise incomes for the poorest families, the minimum wage is probably not the first thing you should be thinking about. Finally, more positively, we just wanted to say that the government's aims of improving the quantity and quality of jobs will help low to middle income families. Progress towards that 80% target basically has to come from low to middle income families. Employment rates for high income families are already very high. If we did that, we would be boosting incomes for the poorest workers. And then secondly, to just point out that there may be complementarities here. So we know that many workers say, I might work more if that job was more flexible and more secure. So yes, those two aims might work hand in hand. Okay, that was all from me. Just wanted to briefly mention that there's more to come in this Unsung Britian series. So we've done a launch paper, a labour market paper. We've got future papers on consumption, housing, health, savings, and more. So please do look out for all that work as well. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nye. Feels like the Resolution Foundation's to-do list you've shown there for the next year. Yes. Okay, that's great. Kate, I saw you sort of nodding or grimacing when Nye was reading that quote out about the person told on Friday to cancel their weekend. But yeah, what is your take on all this?
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for coming. I think it's peak Christmas party week, so I'm very impressed that everyone has managed to get up in the morning and come to an event about the importance of good quality work for everybody. And I just wanted to say, when kicking off, I think sometimes in these events we sort of talk about low to middle income families as if they're a study group rather than our colleagues, our friends and our families. And I really enjoyed hearing some of their voices coming through, and I wanted to bring that through a little bit in my remarks. So I've got 3 points. One is a bit of that and kind of reminding us why it matters. The second one is to say some nice things about the government's agenda, which is still possibly a novelty 6 months in. And the third one is to talk about why fixing this is not just about rights, but also about power. So just to bring you a few more voices, which I think remind us why this agenda really matters. You talked about retail workers, basically, so I've just got some quotes from people who responded to Usda's member survey last year. It was published this year, but they're from 2023. And I think these are really people just reminding us that work isn't just important for work, it has a massive impact on the rest of your life. So all retail workers, all people in employment, but people saying things like, my wage covers my bills, but I don't have enough money for food unless I can get overtime. Somebody saying, I can't take any more away from my kids, they already suffer and I feel like I'm failing them and I can't provide properly. It's not just food and bills, it's clothing too. And then just the last one, I can't afford to have a life outside work, I work and then I come home. So just a reminder that this stuff really makes a difference, not just to what happens when you're at work, but what happens when you're not at work too. And that's why, we place so much importance on this agenda, and it was really great to hear you talking about the voices of those people as well. So what should government be doing about it, and what is it doing about it? Well, we think they are actually making a pretty good start in this area. You have seen that increase in the minimum wage. Necessary but not sufficient, I think, is very much the message of this report and many other work, but I do think it's necessary. That wage floor is important. We have shown over the last decade that we can push the minimum wage higher without employment effects. We still don't think it's gone quite far enough. It's not, we've said 75% of median earnings would be a good benchmark to aim for, still on 66%, but families should see a real term increase in their pay next year, which is really important. But I said not sufficient, and I think the Employment Rights Bill, which is currently in Parliament, is the other key part of this agenda, and very much aimed at some of those issues of security and control that you talked about. So that employment rights bill includes a ban on 0 hours contracts, day one rights, more rights to genuine flexibility at work, better sick pay, and a host of other changes which are aimed, I think, at creating a pretty significant shift in the experience of work for everybody. I think the big question that comes up and has come up when we discuss this is, okay, are we at a trade-off then between quality and quantity of jobs? And I think that was kind of a little bit implicit in your slides, and maybe we can get into it further in the questions. But I think it's really important to remember what an outlier the UK is when it comes to addressing this. We have international evidence, we have evidence from across the OECD and the OECD's own work, suggesting that you can have quality and quantity of jobs can come together, that the trade-offs that we've talked about, you know, the kind of trade-off model is now about 30 years old, basically, and most international evidence has moved on from saying we can either focus on job quantity or job quality. Other countries are achieving that successfully, and what that employment rights bill is about doing is moving us into the international mainstream and saying we shouldn't have to say, well, you can have a job, but I'm afraid your job's going to be a bit rubbish, and that's just a trade-off you and your family are going to make because we don't think we can do better. We know from the international evidence that we can do better, and that employment rights bill is about delivering that. Third point, and it's also one that comes out in the employment rights bill, is those rights are really important. Those mechanisms like the minimum wage are really important. But what's also important about addressing these things is actually giving people a voice in their workplace. And when you read the full report, which I've not fully read, but I have skimmed through most of it, I think it's really interesting what comes out about the kind of quality of management, basically. And often that's partly about the quality of management, which we need to address with better management training. But it's also about not having a voice in the workplace and being able to say, this just doesn't work. Things are being done a little bit wrong here. And of course, we think the solution to addressing that is collective power, the ability to raise your voice collectively and know that you can't be singled out individually if you do say, I don't think this is being done quite right. I thought I'd give you like a small sort of anecdotal example of where this matters, which comes from a recent visit I went on to a warehouse. It's a big distribution warehouse there. I'm distributing food to some of the major supermarkets, and they're automating part of the warehouse. So one end, you've got everybody doing their packing, aided by robots. The other end, everybody's doing it manually. Now, this is helping. It's making the work healthier and safer, and in many ways more satisfying as well. People are quite in favour of this. But there's some little kind of glitches in how it's being implemented, which are driving the workers, you know, real problems for the workers there. So if you work in a warehouse, you probably know your productivity is monitored on a minute-by-minute basis, and your pay is linked to your productivity targets. So everybody is wearing a device on your arm, which is checking how quickly you are doing your tasks. The workers there had found that if the robot broke down, your productivity monitoring doesn't stop, basically, and you had to have that signed off by two separate managers to say, okay, stop tracking my performance because I couldn't be performing because actually the robot has broken down. So a really simple fix, but there isn't a piece of legislation that's going to fix that. What you need is the ability to say, this isn't working, somebody needs to fix it, this is really important, and the ability to speak up. The other thing that had happened was, normally if you do that job, you walk around the outskirts of the warehouse, you walk many miles a day, and as you walk past the toilets and you walk past the water station, so you can go in without having too much of an impact on your productivity. The bit of the warehouse they'd robotised, is that a word? Automated, was all down one end, which meant you had to walk twice as far to get to the loos or to go and get a glass of water. Again, you can't legislate for that, but you can give people the ability to say, this is a problem, you need to change the productivity targets, you need to move the loos, you need to move the water station. And that's why I think that the parts of that employment rights bill, which are about giving people greater collective power, enabling them to join a union, enabling them, when they do that, to raise their voice at work, are an absolutely critical part of changing the experience of work as well as the reward it gives us. So I'll stop there, but thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, Kate. It's sounding almost Victorian Dickensian there at one point, but yes. But no, a very powerful reminder of why workers need power, even now, especially now. Donald.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the great report. It's always nice and always tricky when people look at the overlap between low income and what's happening in the labour market, because, as you say, there isn't a perfect match, but it is important. And it's important because of the differences in experiences that you've pointed out overall, but it's quite difficult to capture. And so my work recently for the Aberdeen Financial Fairness Trust has been looking particularly at the middle, which is, you know, not quite the same as looking at the middle and the bottom all in one. And often we talk about the middle without a lot of sort of specific evidence on it. We sometimes draw, consciously or otherwise, on Will Hutton's 30-year-old characterisation now that you've got the privilege at the top and the disadvantage at the bottom, and the insecure in the middle, which it has its uses, but also is problematic. Its usefulness is that there is a lot of insecurity among people who are not necessarily very poor, who are, I mean, the recent evidence from the Aberdeen Financial Fairness Trust is showing that people have been sailing closer to the wind in those sorts of jobs, on those sorts of incomes than previously, and therefore didn't have as much leeway, for example. And any government that just is useful, because any government that just concentrates on people at the bottom is get its fingers burnt, and then you start getting themes like the squeezed middle, which is often rather ill-defined, because, well, partly because, despite some of the statistic you showed, insecurity per se is quite widely distributed across the distribution. I mean, you excluded people who had employees from this, or sorry, had people working for them who were self-employed. But if you don't exclude that, self-employment is pretty flat across the distribution. As you say, most people in any part of it are not insecure. And you know, if you ask somebody what proportion of people are on 0 hours contracts in the top and the bottom, they might be surprised to hear that it's 1 in 50 at the bottom compared to 1 in 60 at the top, which doesn't sound too alarming in itself. But actually, that's because, you know, insecurity is being experienced widely, but the consequences are different among people who have got more resilience, better social networks, better human capital, and so on. And probably the most interesting statistic I came across in the study, which I recently did, was that if you're in the middle of the distribution this year, you've only got a 40%, this is the middle quintile, you only got about a 40% chance of being in next year, and you've got about a 1 in 3 chance of moving down. So people need protection, they need resilience, and they need greater stability. So I think that one of the really interesting things that you brought out was about this issue about progression compared to job security. I think there's a problematic aspect of this in policy terms, because now that we have a thing called universal credit, it's necessary to prevent people who have got conditionality from working an hour a week and that conditionality being removed. So there's always going to be some degree to which there is some expectation by the state when it's helping people on lower to middle incomes, some expectation about how much they're trying to get into a certain position. But it's certainly an interesting idea, I think, that where you set that, it could change, and the attitude to people's rights on a long-term basis to choose not to work full-time, for example, that we might change that. I mean, it's almost got a link to universal basic income, to sort of say that you remove conditionality in certain circumstances. It's a debate to be had. The other very interesting thing which was picked up in our work was was we often neglect the importance of family situation on insecurity. There are very different pictures if you look at couples with and without children compared to singles with and without children, quite obviously about whether there is any secure job within the family, and actually that's gone backwards for the singles who have got a much, something like a sort of 30 to 40% chance of having this is in the middle of the income distribution, of having a secure job within their household or their family unit, compared to about a 70 or 80% chance if you've got couples. And we need to think in policy terms, I think, more about that. And sort of finally, from policy to politics, some very interesting evidence is being developed at Nuffield and with the Oxford election studies, showing the consequences of insecurity at a political level, and a remarkably strong correlation, stronger than for almost any other factor, between feeling insecure and voting against the incumbent government. And so to turn the sort of Reagan question around, in 2029 we might be asking not, are you better off than you were 5 years ago, but do you feel more confident about your future than you were 5 years ago? And I think that, to come back to what Kate was saying, that about these very promising reforms, that possibly will be the test of those, about whether that question, the answer to that question, starts to change, and the political evidence shows that they'd better hope so.
Great, thank you very much, Donald. I promise things won't be as lousy as they are now is not the most catching campaigning slogan, but yes, maybe it may well be that's all the government can hope for. We'll see. Katie, your work covers employers and progression, universal credit, and how it interacts with work. So, sure, that's what you're going to tell us about.
Great. So thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks for this brilliant report. I have read it all. I've underlined bits. It's fascinating. So yeah, my research focuses mainly on people who are claiming universal credit, both in and out of work, what their experiences are with the welfare system and our employment support services, and also employers' perspectives on that as well. So I'm going to probably draw mainly on those three areas. So I've got 3 points I want to make in response to these report findings, mainly thinking about the kind of future of policy and where I think we need to go. Firstly, I think there's I guess in terms of other welcome policy areas, not just the employment reform bill, it's also the Get Britain Working bill at the same time, and I think there's some really positive developments that we're seeing in that field as well, that really emphasise the need to not just move people into any jobs, but move people into good jobs that fit their circumstances and are also, key to progression in the longer term. For too long, we've had this kind of employment support system that has really been about moving people into any job quickly. Now, that's been effective in terms of moving people into jobs quickly and off the benefits bill, but actually, if we look at the international evidence base on that, in the longer term, it moves people into poorer quality work and also into economic inactivity as well. So if we really want to help people to progress and move on and move ultimately off universal credit, we really need to think about the jobs that we are moving people into. We know that progression from low quality, whether it's insecure work, whether it's low paid work, is really, really difficult, and I think this report provides some important insights into why this is the case. It's a real risk to move jobs. It's a real risk to move sectors, actually, and I think if you're thinking about longer term progression, that is kind of what we need to be thinking about. Nye has outed me as an in-work conditionality obsessive, and I think this is a key policy area that I don't feel like people know that much about. So we're really familiar with this idea that if you're out of work, you're expected to apply for so many jobs and move into any job as quickly as you can. But actually, these new developments where people who are in work and claiming universal credit have kind of crept in over the past kind of decade or so, and I don't think the public or even policymakers actually or employers have really grasped what the implications of these are. So if you move into work and you're still in receipt of in-work benefits, you might be expected to ask for more hours, increase your pay, take on multiple jobs. And we can see from this report that those kind of things are quite difficult asks. So I think if we're really thinking about progression, we need to think about fit from the outset. But I think also we need to think about what actual support is needed to help people move on. So I mean, there was sort of lots of narrative in the report about, you know, people didn't feel like that other opportunities that were available justified that risk and were possible things for people to do. But it makes me wonder, like, what opportunities are people aware of? Who is providing that advice? Where is the kind of the support and the coaching and the nudge and the information about other opportunities available? Where is the support about practical support that is available through childcare and through kind of mapping out transport routes to different jobs and areas? And I think we really need to increase that aspect of support. One of the key things I think that came out of your report was that importance of control, and we've talked about that in relation to people's experiences in the workplace. But the work that we've done, where we've interviewed people who have engaged with our welfare system, moved into pretty low quality work and tracked their experiences over time, people actually, that's an additional source of a lack of control, where people feel trapped between a welfare system that says take any job, employers who are offering not a particularly good quality experience, and people feel like they can't really move on from that. So I think there's some really positive changes from what we've seen in the Get Britain Working White Paper, but the key thing is really, I think, that we need to think about is actually thinking about employers and the nature of the opportunities that they are offering. So if you're the people that you spoke to in Worcester turned around and said, actually, yes, I do want to increase my pay and I do want to take on more hours and I would like to take on additional job roles, what do you think that the response of employers is going to be? Like, are they just going to say, yes, brilliant, we'll offer those to you? Well, actually, we asked employers this very same question. We took out the new parameters of in-work conditionality to 80 employers across social care, retail, hospitality, and we said, how would you respond if your employees who were claiming universal credit asked you for these new conditions? And actually, probably unsurprisingly, they were not too happy about this policy development. So there were some employers who would welcome that extra push from people to work more, but overall, it was really clear that the kind of low costs, flexible employment models that were pretty commonplace across these sectors didn't really marry up with these ideas that people would all of a sudden be working full time. You know, it was really common for people to be working part time with that expectation, a very real expectation, to flex up whenever the employer needed it. Now that's not okay, but to put pressure on workers in that situation to increase their hours is totally the kind of wrong direction. So these blunt kind of approaches to employment policy are just not going to work within our flexible labour market. And my final point really is that actually it's employers where those changes are really needed. We've talked about bad managers, and that's, you know, very much within a workplace, but actually those bad management practices extend to job redesign as well. Like, there is no reason why so many more jobs couldn't be structured around a school run. Like, it's not that we know what time it is. It's like, you know, there's no reason for these things, and there's just a real kind of, you know, the lack of capacity to actually develop their working practices that fit around a kind of modern workforce, which includes people with caring responsibilities, people with health conditions as well, is just, you know, we're pretty much in the dark ages, so that's where we need to catch up with our international partners as well. We talk about bad management a lot when we're talking about productivity, and these debates haven't really crept into when we're talking about employment support and how we help people to move into and progress in work. And I think, you know, it's brilliant that we've got both the Get Britain Working White Paper and the employment bill as well. And I think that those two things really need to work together, because we can't have one without the other. And I think getting employers and trade unions as well around the table as we develop these policies is key to helping people move into and progress in good work.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Katie. I definitely want to come back to what employers can do and what government can do to make employers do things differently. So there's absolutely loads there. I'm going to start roughly structure our discussion by first of all talking about the nature of work and how it's changed, then pay and progression, and then we'll get on towards policy. So that's warning my panelists to get ready for these questions. But that was a really good question I wanted to start with, or it's a question that was very similar to something I was going to ask the panel anyway, which we could show now. Now, you don't have to answer this question exactly, but something that I've picked up, firstly from a report that Resolution Foundation did a couple of years ago, where we looked at big, long trends in what people think about their workplace and experience at work. The one that Dan and Christian did, where we showed that low-wage workers in particular were just finding the job more stressful, less fun. And then what Kate said about being workers at a warehouse being tracked chimed with what Niall, you said about the call centre person being tracked. I mean, it really is the case, isn't it, that low-wage workers in some sectors are monitored and tracked and overseen so much more than they used to be, and also so much more than high-income workers were, and in a way which probably is not what they expected when they were at school. I mean, Kate, do you want to start on reflections on that?
I don't know what people's expectations were when they were at school, but I do think the sort of experience of work is really interesting. I think it's actually some work from the Resolution Foundation a few years ago which talked to retail workers about their experience over time, and I think I was talking to workers from Debenhams who were saying, I used to have a whole load of autonomy on the shop floor. My job was about serving the customers, about thinking about how what their needs were, and now my job is manning the tills, and we don't have anyone on the shop floor anymore. If you go to, I went to a car factory quite recently, and again, experience of automation, generally positive, generally uptick in health and safety, but the repetitive nature of the tasks and the removal of skill and discretion from some of those tasks is something I think we actually need to pay much more attention to. So, all of us want to feel like we've made a difference in our work. You want to feel like you have kind of mastery and control, key attributes of psychological well-being. And I think when we talk about productivity, actually, it's really important about how we want to achieve higher productivity. It's the kind of, holy grail of all policymakers. But we have to ask, at what cost is that productivity being achieved? What does it mean for the people who are, the kind of agents of productivity, if you like? And what might be the other consequences of that? I think we probably don't have enough work on, the mental health impacts of work. It's certainly something when you start to talk to employers, they will tell you about, basically. But I think it is definitely an area where we do need more research. We need more listening to the actual experiences of workers. And I do think, I will come back to this point, that giving people the power to say to their bosses, actually, that might make us 30 seconds faster, but it's going to remove all enjoyment and pleasure I can get out of my working day is really important.
Thank you. And Nine, in a previous project, you talked to social care workers, and that's an industry where the workers tend to say they love the caring bit, but so many other aspects of the job are much less fun. Yeah,
that's exactly what I was going to mention. So we did a report asking many similar questions to social care workers. What do you like about your job? What is unpleasant about it? And obviously they talked about pay and stress, but autonomy was really, really important. At the moment, because the social care sector is under a lot of pressure, it's basically the minimum wage which is pushing up pay in that sector, but there are supermarkets in some parts of the country where you can get a higher paying job. And we asked those workers, well, you've described all the bad things about social care, why don't you go and do that? They said, well, no, I need some autonomy. They didn't use the word, but that's what they were talking about. I don't like the idea of going sitting on the tills. I really like this interactive part of my job. Although they also said that some of the ways they are managed made that hard, having to do appointments really quickly, having checkboxes to work through and not being able to use their initiative. So I think these things are really important. You could also see it in the chart I put up. So it might be tempting to imagine that high-skilled people want a job where they're being creative and using initiative, and low-skilled people want a job that pays the bills and then they go home. But you could see that using your initiative and using your abilities was, albeit slightly less important, but still very important for the lowest income workers as well. So it's absolutely not something that we should be forgetting. Thank you. Donald, okay, do you have any reflection? Go, Donald.
Yeah, I mean, I was at school a very long time ago, and I don't think we should romanticise. I mean, in those days, a lot of people thought that what work was going to be like would be boring, repetitive, but it would be pay the bills and be stable. Are we in a new paradigm I mean, at the moment we seem to be getting the worst of both worlds, but some of the sorts of human-facing jobs that you're talking about, we should learn collectively how to improve them. Possibly not try to tell people at school that they're going to be like that if they're not, but I mean, there is a collective learning experience, I think, about how that can be beneficial.
I think it's stress at work now that's kind of converged. Can you remember? I'm asking you about a report you didn't write from several years ago. I think it is stress at work, where low-wage workers used to be a lot less stressed at work than high-paid workers, but that gap's converged because we've made work more stressful for low-paid people. So yes, you're right. I'm not trying to romanticise, but there's something in the data that shows things have got a little bit worse. Katie, any reflections on how the labour market has changed, the nature of work has changed?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about school now. I mean, the labour market has changed, and it will continue to keep changing. And I think, when the advice that you get and the support that you get at school kind of prepares you to some extent, but I think the importance of having really robust support as people progress through their working lives is so essential. And it's essential when we're thinking about actually, if we need to move away from emphasising supporting people into higher paid sectors. It's essential when we're thinking about how people's lives change and their different needs and their circumstances and where they are in their kind of life stages. But I think, I guess it's that contract with, it's been so focused on the key answer to most things is to move into work. And actually that isn't delivering for a lot of people. So the answer to that question isn't, let's put more pressure on people who are in work.
Thank you, okay, going to move on to, is it directly relevant? Otherwise I might move on. Okay, I promise I'll come to the audience at some point. I want to go next to pay. So if there's like one thing you might have heard from Resolution Foundation over the last few years, it's that average pay hasn't changed very much in the last 2 decades. It's basically the fact that NI comes up with every month. We asked average
Still
pay.
True.
Still true, exactly. And yet, when NI showed that chart, when we talked to low-income workers, pay comes up sometimes, but it's not like the most important thing they talk about. Is there a contradiction there, or do we think it's just the case that people have just stopped assuming they're going to get pay rises and have lowered their expectations accordingly? I don't know whether any of our panel wanted to go on that one. Nye, go on.
I'll give you my theory. Well, so some of our focus groups did, one of the questions was, what would be the thing that would most improve your work? And I think there was basically an awkwardness about saying, I want to get paid more. Okay. So you could, once we'd gone around the table and people had talked about, management practices, and someone did put their hand up and just said, I just want to get paid more. Everyone else was like, well, yes.
The British reticence talking about.
So I think that was the case for those kind of groups. I think in the survey question, I just wonder if people don't see pay as something they're shopping around for in the same sense. If you're used to looking for similar types of jobs, you might have an assumption that they're all more or less paid the same, especially if you're working in a world where you're fairly close to the minimum wage. And to bring in an academic study, there was a good one recently which showed that people have really bad knowledge about the extent to which they could raise their pay by changing jobs. People basically assume that their next best job would pay the same as their current job. Yeah. So I just wonder if people have bad information or bad knowledge about their own sort of pay prospects outside of the job they're already doing.
Just a couple of points from me. One is obviously your pay is relative to what other things cost. So when I and we and many other people come out with that fact on a monthly basis, it is your real value of pay. So they might be thinking, I wish my shopping was cheaper, I wish my housing wasn't so expensive, rather than thinking I wish my pay was higher. But the thing that is definitely a problem, and if you think back to those quotes I was saying, I have to work overtime if I want to buy food, their pay is a problem. I suppose the other thing is, I'm a bit sceptical about no one ever changing sector. This comes from talking to employers when I was on the Low Pay Commission. Over the last few years, every employer in every low wage sector you talk to would say, if they were in care, they'd say, retail are stealing all our workers. Might not be actually true, but it must be true enough for them to all have said that. Talk to employers in retail, they will say, there's some high-paying distribution jobs. The distribution are stealing all of our workers. So I think people do shop around for pay, basically. People are aware of what their colleagues earn, where somewhere new has opened. And it's certainly something that employers are super aware of when they are in their pay setting process, is competition for staff. And employers are still talking about, when employers talk about skills shortages, they mean we cannot get anyone to do the job at the rate we are paying, basically. So I think it's hard not to see, you know, people do change sectors and they do change sectors for pay.
Yeah, great.
I think
Katie.
on pay, I think especially for people who are in receipt of universal credit, so their income comes from both their universal credit payment and work. You make the point in the report about kind of tapers and you know the difference to work, but actually when we've spoken to UC claimants or employers who offer people more work, it's more about that fluctuation. And I think when people because your UC payment adjusts, if you earn more one month, then you earn less in universal credit the next. And that volatility of income is so difficult to manage, especially if you're on a low income and you haven't got that buffer of savings, that actually we found that people are reluctant to take on more pay when it's not offered on a consistent basis, because it messes with people's income and payment. It's supposed, you know, the design of universal credit is supposed to be mimicking the labour market and making things smoother, but actually it's made a real headache. And also one of the things, it's a kind of related point, is because the amount of income that you receive for a universal credit is automatically determined through the HMRC system. If your employer makes a mistake with your pay, then that will have a knock-on impact onto you, and employers have got no kind of mechanism to correct that, which is, you know, people are really nervous about taking on more hours, and I think that that's something that, you know, when we're talking about disincentives, doesn't always get picked up.
Thank you. Let's go from pay to progression. I mean, that's which is the way in which individuals, you know, can see their earnings rise. I mean, my big take is that progression is something that politicians leap to when they don't want to do anything. They can't think what to do, so they'll appeal to progression. But Nye, this report, and you and Louise definitely spoke to some low-income workers about what they thought about progression and what they thought their prospects were. Some of which was in your presentation, but tell us what else you found.
Well, there's basically just this sense that it wasn't necessarily worth it. So this was a group of people who said they didn't like all aspects of their job, they'd like to be paid more. And so you say, well, okay, have you considered changing jobs or moving to a job that pays you more? And often the next response was, well, no, that's not something I want to do. And I just think that's such an interesting tension. It was for a variety of reasons. If progression means changing jobs, as Katie said, a lot of workers just said that just feels too risky. You get, you know, statements like "better the devil you know," like, you know, I've kind of figured out how to get along with my manager, my colleagues, and fit that around. I don't want to start again. So you hear that a lot. In terms of progressing in your own company, earning more, maybe moving to a slightly more senior job, I mean, there's the long talked about problem of, you know, the extra hourly pay you get for doing a more tricky job isn't necessarily worth it, and that is sometimes linked to the minimum wage. So you'll hear people saying, you know, I'm working on the shop floor in a supermarket, I could be a supervisor and get 50 people an hour, but that means I have to stay to the end of the shift to lock up, and I'm not sure that's worth it. So I think it was a real range. But I think Kate's right. I mean, these are people who said progression feels risky to me, or changing jobs feels risky to me. We shouldn't forget that many people do change jobs all the time, and people do progress all the time. So when I showed you that chart of the groups who are progressing less quickly than others, who change jobs less quickly than others, that was relative to an average. So you know, in the data I was looking at, in any given year, I think something like 50% of people who are low paid move to a higher hourly pay decile. So the labour market is always dynamic. People are always moving within it. That's absolutely right. I was more trying to draw out the groups for whom that progression or changing jobs feels most difficult and most risky.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, insofar as we think that's a very important phenomenon, I think it really raises once again the issue about whether you have a kind of work first entry into work policy. So that you're putting pressure on people to take any job, if that's going to be the final job that you're going to be in, rather than looking around for something which is a bit better paid, a bit more responsibility. That becomes a much more important issue.
Yeah, and Kate, I know you're not on the commission now, but this is something the Low Pay Commission would look at an awful lot, isn't it? The extent to which...
It found that low-paid workers are less likely to move off low pay, and I don't think any of my colleagues from the LPC are here, but a significant amount of people do move off low pay in any other year. I do think, though, like you said, it's a very sort of individualised response. It's, you're struggling, why don't you get a better job? Is basically the kind of thought behind in-work conditionality, behind many kind of areas which say, rather than improving your job, let's just ask you to get another one. That doesn't mean we shouldn't pay attention to progression, and we know that progression is possible in organisations which have structured career ladders. So if you work for the NHS, an actually big issue for social care workers is, can I get into the NHS? There is a structure of pay grades. They come with different training. You know what the different jobs involved, and you can take some of the decisions about you know, is it worth me getting those extra skills? Is it worth me taking on that extra responsibility? Because there is a clear pay grade. Also, because you have a common set of terms and conditions, you know that your flexible working agreement should be across everybody in that kind of progression group, whatever grade you're on. And so it's not, oh, I've negotiated this deal with my manager, so I don't want to take a different job. It's, I have the right to request flexible working, or I have the right to flexible working, and therefore when I get my next job, I have that right too. So I think we have to think about those collective kind of cross-sector or cross-economy policies, rather than this kind of relentless focus on, why don't you just get some more skills and then maybe a better job will turn up.
Thank you. And Katie, I'm going to pick on you. I mean, there's an argument that what's in the government's employment rights bill and its, you know, its steps that might increase worker power will be not just good for workers in their jobs, but might also reduce some of the risks of progressing by. Do you think there's anything in that argument?
I think so, but then I think it comes back to the point that these two policy reforms need to work together at the same time. So you can improve work, but if you're still continuing to kind of line people up and make them take any job that's available, then it kind of undermines the benefits that we might see there. So I think, you know, it's really positive that we've got that emphasis on good quality work. It's really positive that you can see that in the Get Britain Working white paper. I think what we're missing is perhaps a kind of stronger sense of actually what good quality work looks like. So if you look at the white paper, there's lots of, you know, we're going to support people into good jobs and things like that, but there's no kind of clear definition and clarity about what that looks like. And I think when we're thinking about how we're putting some of these policies into practice, when we're thinking about a lot of these policies in terms of taking them forward, if you're thinking more about devolution and more localised approaches, I think having a really clear common framework that says, you know, what do we understand by good jobs? And it's not just things that we can legislate for, it's all those additional things as well. I think that would be one way to kind of tie those two areas together a bit better.
Great, thanks. We'll take some questions from the audience here. Is yours still relevant? Yeah. Do we have a roving mic? Does anyone got a roving mic? Greg's got the roving mic. We'll take this gentleman towards the front and then the lady in the very front row, and then we'll see what the panel say.
Hi, Tom Rees from Bloomberg. Given that you were saying that the gains need to be made amongst this group to reach the 80% employment target, I was just wondering if that makes reaching that target more or less difficult. You know, obviously there's been a lot of progress in the last couple of decades, but I don't know, does that, maybe that progress means that progress further on is harder or you reach a ceiling? And I was just wondering if any of the panelists would be as bold as saying that they thought they were actually going to reach this 80% target.
Okay, great. While you're thinking about that, we'll take the second question.
Hi, I'm Maria. I'm from the UK Baha'i Office of Public Affairs, and I'm basically just wondering, you know, this kind of crisis of work that we're in right now, of all these different kind of moving pieces being quite a lot more disadvantaged than they used to be. Maybe it calls for like some kind of fundamental rethinking around work and how it fits into society and how it fits into people's lives, and not simply kind of like relegating it to like, okay, this is like your personal problem, you have to kind of deal with it and fix it on your own. And maybe that stops us from getting stuck into these very technocratic solutions around work of like, if we just shift moving pieces then everything will fall into place. But actually maybe it's about going back to first principles and thinking around like what makes work meaningful, how does that tie in with our identity, how does that tie in with our places, our communities, like the way that we envision our lives. And I just wonder, like, yeah, how have you seen that working? Because I think some of these more or like some of these questions around meaning, purpose, and identity, we often think, oh, that's for like the high-paid sector, and that's for people who have the time, the energy to think about that. But actually, it's fundamental to all kinds of work. And I'm just wondering how you've kind of interacted with that question in your work.
Okay, great. I was definitely going to touch on the 80% target later on, but we can do it. We should do it now. Nye, I mean, there's no doubt this is a very ambitious target, right?
It's very ambitious. When we were doing our pre-election stuff, we plotted an employment rate chart and then we put a dot for 80%. We drew a line, and then someone from the government said, "Well, we didn't mean it exactly then because the line that sort of gets to 80% looks sort of terrifyingly steep, and it looks implausibly steep basically." And I think that line was getting there by the end of the Parliament. So I don't think they've said that's what they mean by it, and fair enough. But it's definitely very ambitious. To give you the UK employment rate basically always used to max out at 73%, going back to the 70s. Every time we had sort of full employment, we recovered from a downturn, we got to 73%, and then we stayed there until the next crisis came along, and that was true 70s, 80s, 90s. And then in the 2010s, we had this big change. So we recovered from the financial crisis, went past 73% in 2015, and then we kept going, and that was a big surprise to everyone. So we started scratching our heads about that, and we came up with some theories about people raising their labour supply in response to earnings and income stagnation. And so, if that is the reason why employment rate rose in the run-up to the pandemic, then you might think, well, are those conditions still around, and could those drive further? Well, yes, they are. Earnings can continue to stagnate. We're still not living through golden economic times. That's a good question. Does the fact that these increases need to come from low to middle income households mean it's harder? I don't think so. Because that's where all the increases came in the 2010s, and there still are very large gaps. As I showed, I think 60% and 90% are very large gaps indeed. So you wouldn't have to close, you wouldn't have to get all the way to that higher income target to make meaningful inroads. The flip side of that is that many of those groups are the ones where, maybe through health or disability or other circumstances, there are barriers that need to be overcome to raise employment. So kind of a bit of a fence-sitting answer. But I think you definitely can get to 80% because that other countries are there. So it's definitely plausible. You possibly can't get there in this Parliament, although absolutely do try. And the fact that it has to come from low to middle income households means you have to think hard about these questions of support and barriers, but those can definitely be overcome.
Thanks. Do you want to come in?
I wouldn't say a huge amount more of what Nye said. I suppose just one bit of one thing I think about when I hear the target, and it is an ambitious target, but as Nye said, other countries have got there. So a long time ago, I used to work for the single parent charity Gingerbread at a time when the target for lone parent employment was 70% and the employment rate was 54%. And we were always like, yes, it's a good target, but give more support, and it's been met, basically. So that was in the kind of 2010s, and it felt really, really ambitious. I think there is a problem if it's met because people are so poor they have to go into work. If it's, would it be every family's preference to have 2 full-time workers? I don't know. So I think we do have to, it links to the second question about, what we want from work, how we reimagine it, what employment in the context of that target actually looks like, how full-time is it? But that was a stretch target and we got there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of relates to what has been said about the target. I mean, the question is it a useful target if you can achieve it most easily by getting a lot of people into very, very poor quality and very, very part-time casualised jobs. I mean, our definition of being in employment is working anything at all.
Yeah,
so
1 hour a week,
I think 1 hour a week. I think it's really it links the two questions together, which is are we looking for quantity? Are we looking for quality? Or are we redefining it? Surely the progression since the 70s is not so repeatable because a lot of it's closing the gap between genders.
Yep.
Yeah?
Yep.
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
a good point.
Okay, great. On to the second question, which I'm just going to broaden slightly because I promised we'd come back to employers, and I think a lot of what we've heard today is that the nature of work, the work conditions, the nature of work that low to middle income work experience is often dictated by what employers are doing and how employers are structuring their. So, Katie, I wanted to invite you to any reflections on the question asked, but also, where are employers all this, and if employers are doing the wrong thing, whose job is it to make them do something different?
Right. Where are employers on this? I mean, that's a really good question. So the report I mentioned previously, so we conducted the first major independent study that asked employers about universal credit and these changes to our active labour market policies. So it's the first time that was done, which I like to say as an academic, because I like to say, oh, we did that first. But it's baffling that hadn't been done before. Like, these are fundamental changes in the way that we kind of structure our employment policies. No other country has really tried to expand conditionality to people who are in work, and it's got massive implications for employers when we're thinking about getting people into jobs and supporting people to progress in there, and how these different policy levers could make. So it's been a real gap in terms of policymaker thinking, in terms of engaging with employers and getting them involved. It's not about kind of creating policies that necessarily pander to the kind of state of employment that we've got now, but it's about really understanding where the opportunities are and where the barriers are to improving things going forward. So it's baffling that employers haven't been more involved in this policy conversation, but it's also baffling that kind of employer representative organisations haven't been more vocal on this conversation either. I remember a quote from CBI, who was asked, I think it was by the Financial Times, and they said, how is this going to impact on employers if people are expected to progress in work? And the quote just said, oh, we'll survey our members once the policy's rolled out, which is just like, these are 1 million people who might be subject to these new expectations. So, I mean, I think that employer representatives really need to kind of step up and be much more involved in this. But I think it's about kind of working together, again, with trade unions, with the state, and with people who are actually subject to these policies, and we hope will benefit from them.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to reflect on the second question? Okay, we can definitely too prosaic for our panel. Let's go to the poll. I know we're running out of time, but I want to talk about some other policy issues. So this is for you guys at home or in the audience. Go to slido.com. The code is labour market. Thinking about all the things that this government says it will do over the next Parliament, what do you think will be the most important one for improving low to middle income families, workers' experience of the labour market? Raising a minimum wage, where the government has a commitment to reflect the cost of living in a way that's not entirely clear what that means. Increasing employment towards that 80% target. Reforming job centres, so turning them into job and career centres. Sorry, I've forgotten the exact term. Tackling long-term sickness, which was the other big theme of the employment bill, or improving employment rights. So you guys can vote. I might ask the panel what they think as well. Nye, what do you think the most important thing the government's going to do?
So as written, so improving LMI workers' experience, so it's definitely improving employment rights.
Yeah.
If it was a more broad question on what would most help LMI workers, then arguably increasing employment. Obviously, all the caveats around what kind of employment, but that really is how our poorest families became less poor in recent decades. And so if that is achieved, it would have that effect again, and it would be a very big effect going to 80%. But yes, as written, I would definitely pick the last one, improving employment rights.
Great. Kate?
Obviously, I'm going to pick improving employment rights, but partly because it's the area that, the government hasn't looked at for 14 years.
Yeah.
I don't think we should have to choose.
Yep. Yep. Oh, and as we have said, I was trying to argue earlier, there are also, if you're improving the worker power particularly, you might get kind of wider spillovers across the labour market. It might improve dynamism, it might improve progression. So it's not just about making the work day more satisfying and less miserable. Donald?
Yeah, well, improving employment quality is something we've talked a lot about and isn't on here, but I think the tackling long-term sickness is going to be very important, at least in terms of perception, and that's important.
Yeah, thanks. Katie?
I'm always obsessed with job centres, but I'm gonna go with the final one, because I do think that ultimately the key here is changing employer practices and improving the quality of work.
Yeah, great. And then maybe I could just push the panel on trade-offs. I mean, Kate, you were quite bold earlier on in saying there's not a trade-off. That was between job quality and the number of jobs. But And you're absolutely right that we basically prove that we can push the minimum wage up from its very, very low level in the late 1990s to where it is now, 60% of median earnings, with seemingly no impact on employment. But maybe we think that that high minimum wage has caused a bit more insecurity. It's compressed wages a bit at the bottom. It's led to some of the kind of perks and non-pecuniary stuff going. If the government now pushes hard on employment rights and puts up employer national insurance, and also maintains its ambition on the minimum wage, at some point is it at some risk we might see some negative effects? Donald, dying to come in?
Well, eventually you have to, because if you doubled it tomorrow, you would. But as the person who sort of originally produced the basis for the living wage, I'm very interested to see the convergence. I did a graph after the last announcement showing that they've virtually caught up. It's within a 3% from being about 20% different. So I think that in terms of living standards and what it can do for that, I don't think it's any more the most important thing if it ever was.
Yeah, thanks. Nye.
I think everyone would agree at some point there's a trade-off between labour costs and how much labour employers are demanding. The thing that gets brushed over a bit is that not all of the things that are in the improving employment rights or that could raise job quality cost that much money. So some of it you can think of quite similarly to the minimum wage. Like, for example, if you raise sick pay, that is just fairly directly a cost, although there might be offsetting benefits as well. But some of it I don't think is necessarily that costly. So I think there's a big gap at the moment between, I think employers just sort of see all this stuff in the papers about employment rights, and it all sounds very scary. But I mean, not all of it I don't think is necessarily incredibly costly. Being a bit more, planning your shifts a bit better, giving workers more advance. Obviously, there are some circumstances where, you've made a commitment to a shift, you no longer need it, that costs money. But there are many where, you can improve workers' experiences of these types of jobs without necessarily costing. So those kind of, avoiding the trade-off type versions of improving job quality, I think, are underrated.
Okay.
Let me just expand a little bit on what I said. So I think it's possible to think there might be some frictional costs of changing to a new model. Employers will have to prepare for those costs. Some employers will have been deliberately running a model of employment which seeks to exploit labour market flexibilities, and this is saying, we don't think that's the right way to run your economy. There are some costs which are just a transfer, basically, from employers to workers. Sick pay is one of them. We are saying, yes, employers should be responsible for your sick pay from the first day off you're sick, but that's moving money from the employer to the worker. It's not, that disappears. But I think we should remember the massive benefits. So, the government's impact assessment quantifies about a 0.4% increase in employment costs from the measures in the bill. I think most people would think that employers can cope with a 0.4% increase in their pay bill. Some research we've done suggests there could be up to £13 billion worth of benefits from better health, better productivity, some of the costs of staying in work. So I think it's really important that we remember this is shifting us to a better model, not just shifting the model.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. I think we'll end it there. Let's see what the 32 of you who voted think. Very much not a representative, a large enough sample to make strong inferences. Improving employment rights, yes, I think that's probably right. It has the potential to make work better for many millions of workers, we said before. And so I just want to highlight one more question, which is not directly about this, but maybe about our whole programme. Can we just highlight? Can we show the highlighted question at all? Yes, very well. So somebody has asked whether, has pointed out there is an ethnicity angle to much of this, and I just wanted to say that yes, we covered this in our launch report. So the launch report's called Unsung Britain and came out in November, and we showed very clearly that there is an ethnic dimension to being in a low-income household, and that's changed over time. And I wanted to plug that in the new year. We have a paper entirely devoted to ethnic inequalities in our housing market, in our experience of housing insecurity, and in housing quality. So it's very much something we are aware of, even if we haven't touched on it today in our very kind of high-level, big picture stuff. So I wanted to say that. That's it. I think it's 11:15. So we'll just end by thanking the panel and thank you all for your questions.